On today's show, the Chris Middleton deadline day has arrived, and we're just sitting here waiting for some news. We're just over 24 hours away from the NBA draft as we record this podcast, and we think, or maybe we will see, whether the Bucks make any moves, which brings us to a conversation today. How should the Bucks actually build out a postseason rotation? We've spoke so much about depth in the last few years, and ultimately, you only need a few players that are going to play in the postseason. So how should the Bucks attack this? Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Bucks. My name's Kane Pittman. You can see and hear me on this show Monday to Friday, and also find my work over at ESPN. And alongside me, the founder of brewhoop.com and longtime voice of the podcast, Frank Madden, from his car, and may or may not have another human in the car with him, a little human. Frank, it is always good to catch up with you, and we are going to have, there is the baby. I think that's first view for Locked On Bucks YouTube. That's an exclusive, a world exclusive on the Locked On Podcast Network here today. But I'm excited to be podcasting with Frank, not only because this is a fun time of year with free agency coming up, the draft coming up, but we've got a live pod coming up. Frank's going to roll into town next Wednesday night, June 28 at Broken Bat Brewery. Everyone should come along. I was going for a run yesterday. Someone stopped me and said, "Are you Kane Pittman?" I said, "Yeah." And I said, "We're going to live pod. Come on." I don't know whether they're going to do it or not, but everyone, we're all excited here to meet everyone and talk Bucks and maybe have some news, Frank, over the next week or so here.
Yeah. Let me just add a disclaimer too for people that haven't heard me say this on other pods. My house is being renovated. I have a 6-week-old kid. I'm on paternity leave for the next 2 months, which is pretty awesome. And so basically in the mornings, I just try to get out of my house, drop my dog, my 5-year-old off at her camps. And then, I'll go to Panera Bread, which is where I've now done a salary cap preview podcast from Panera Bread. And today I was just there, and then I was like, it's a little loud in here. Baby looked a little agitated, so figured I'd come in here. By the way, I do not drive around with a baby sitting in the front passenger seat. Just to be clear, I just have her here in the parked car so that when she gets agitated, I can give her pacifier when it falls out and fun things like that. But yeah, really excited to be heading back to Milwaukee next week. Kane, seeing Eric, Camille, Justin, and obviously a ton of you guys that have been listening to us for hopefully years or weeks or days, whatever length of journey you've been on with us. Always fun just to kind of bring the community together. I always say, that's what makes sports fun, is the kind of community around it. And obviously this is such a fun way that we do that. So to be together again, Kane, 5 years since the first and only time we met. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, only second time. It's crazy. I've done over 1,000 episodes of this show now, which is also just insane to think about. But I'm meeting you for the second time, and I've said it before. I think I've spent more time talking to you than just about anyone else in my life, I think, over the last 4 or 5 years. Let's dive right into it. And let me just ask you a question straight away. It is Wednesday as we're recording this. The draft is on Thursday night. Are the Bucks going to make a trade, Frank? How do you feel about this right now as you pour through all the options in your mind?
Yeah, I think I've got a grunting baby now. Great. She's awake. I think they will. I think they will draft somebody. Obviously, right now they have the 58th pick. We saw them a year ago basically use the last pick to get Hugo Besson. We'll see if we see Hugo Besson in Summer League. But I think they will definitely, maybe if they don't keep that pick, I think they'll maybe buy or trade somehow up to a higher pick. One of the challenges, they have basically no second round picks left after the Jay Crowder deal. Again, I know a lot of people are like, second round picks, who cares? You always buy more. But, again, there are limits to how much you can just continually buy second round picks, especially picks that are, in the higher kind of, front half of a round. So I think, again, we'll kind of see what happens. I think probably the big question, in terms of the roster, we've obviously spent a lot of time talking about with the Bradley Beal experience, right? Talking about Chris Middleton and Drew Holiday, and are there scenarios where, with Chris Middleton down the road that you could trade him once he's actually signed again? Is there a scenario with Drew Holiday that you would consider trading him for? I am happy that, no one has seriously in the media been talking. I know that there's always kind of discussions ongoing with Bucks fans about it. I'm happy that there hasn't been any discussions in like the national media about like, oh, Drew Holiday is available, or like, oh, they were shopping Drew Holiday in the Bradley Beal deal. Because I think, again, like, better for the stability of the team that those guys are kind of kept out of those sorts of situations. But the Drew Holiday trade when he came here came out of nowhere, right? And it seems like the Bucks have had two general sorts of trades: the kinds that completely come out of the blue, and the kind that are telegraphed for months, right? The PJ Tucker deal and the Jay Crowder deal. Like, we heard about their interest in those guys for like months and months and months, and it was just like, are they actually going to do something? I would not expect, a Drew Holiday trade on draft night. Again, I think there is, as we've talked about, I think there's a valid discussion to be had with him a year away from his player option. What does an aging Drew Holiday look like on this team over the next few years? You're kind of at an inflection point, I think, with Drew, where if you were going to move him, now might be the best time to do that. But again, are you going to get equal value for him? Are you going to get a guy that fits? I think Beal, again, age-wise would have fit better, but he makes significantly more. And, from a fit standpoint, he's less of a ball handler than even Drew is, right? So I think getting value back on Drew is really hard, right? But in principle, I think it is worth asking a question, especially given his age and the age of the roster on Giannis, is that worth thinking about. But I think if there was going to be a trade, I think there's, I'll say 4 guys that I would at least think are worth mentioning. I think obviously Grayson Allen, Bobby Portis, Pat Connaughton, those are the guys that we normally would think of, just given where they are in terms of their salary. I don't know how much you can hear this baby kind of like grunting over here. She's got a pacifier in, but she's maybe not happy about the mention of Bobby Portis and Pat Connaughton in potential trades.
Exactly.
I think those guys, I think it's worth at least exploring. I think the Bucks have to explore what the market is for those guys. I think Bobby and Grayson sort of, I think, have both had similar stories, obviously positionally very different, but they've both been guys that have been, I think, good regular season players. And then in the postseason, obviously, especially in that Boston series last year, the obvious question was like, well, how do these guys really contribute, and how are they going to be winning players against the number one rival that you have in your conference? And it sucks because, like, I feel bad for Grayson Allen. By the way, he had a 66% true shooting percentage against the Heat in the first round of the playoffs. In his Bucks playoff career, he's over 60% true shooting. So basically he shot the shit out of the ball in 2 of the 3 series that he's been in with the Bucks. But unfortunately, he, struggled defensively against the bigger Celtics, couldn't make shots. And that's what people think of, that's what we think of him from the playoff perspective, right? You kind of gloss over the fact that he hit a lot of shots, even against the Heat. And with Bobby, I think obviously there's much more goodwill towards Bobby, given the key role he played in closing out the Suns in particular. Obviously, he was big against the Hawks as well in that championship run a couple years ago. But, anytime you have a guy making $10, $11 million and dollars are as tight as they are, I think you at least have to ask the question of, is there a way that you could trade these guys and get something back that could potentially help you more in the playoffs in particular moving forward? And again, I think there's probably going to be very obvious trade-offs. And a draft is obviously a natural time to think about it because, teams like the Pacers get talked about as like, oh, the Pacers, they need a power forward, right? Maybe they'll draft one. But hey, Bobby Portis, I think, would look great on the Pacers. Bobby Portis would look great on the Charlotte Hornets, right? And a lot of those teams, they have not just picks in the lottery, which obviously you're not going to get one of those picks for Bobby Portis, but, is there a deal where you could get a pick in the late 20s or a pick in the 30s plus a player who hopefully could still actually be a rotation guy for you, right? And maybe it's a different type of player, right? Maybe it's a wing player, or maybe it's a guard, maybe ball handler, something different, right? Again, it's sort of worth asking the question, but I also want to be really careful, I think, because, there still is a regular season, right? So even if you question those guys as postseason players, you don't want to finish 5th in the conference or something like that because you didn't have good regular season players, guys that could fill in for Giannis, and
you might
guys
want to avoid the 8
Yeah. Yeah, that's the upside, right? If you get the 5th seed, at least then you wouldn't have to play the Heat again. But anyway, so it's hard. I think it's a needle threading exercise. I don't think it's a no brainer to trade any of those guys. I think with Grayson, because he's going to be an expiring contract, and the fact that, I mean, he's a really good regular season player. I mean, he's not a star player. He's, not a really high end player, but makes a reasonable salary, right? $9 million, shoots 40% from three every year, can do a little bit off the dribble. I think he's been an improved defender the last 2 years as well. I mean, he should have demand around the league. Bobby should have demand for, it's with certain teams. So I think the question is just, is what you get back worth it? And especially relative to the draft, right? Like we talk about like, oh, could you, use one of those guys, like could you use Bobby to get like a late first round pick, early second round pick, something like that. I think you got to get a player back that you think can actually fit and maybe isn't like a slam dunk to be a playoff rotation player, but at least has a chance, right? And on top of that, I think it's fair to ask the question of like, hey, the first round picks are cool, high second round picks are cool, but what's the thesis behind adding those guys, right? Is the idea that, those guys can mature with this team and, potentially be guys that 2-3 years from now, are kind of, maybe you hit on one or two of those guys and they're the ones compensating for the aging of some of the other players. Like that's a reasonable thesis to me. The idea though, that like, I mean, let's look at this front office draft history. I mean, look, it's hard drafting from late first round, second round, but I don't have a ton of faith that they're going to hit a home run with, a pick at a spot where you're typically not getting, certainly not an immediate impact guy. But in most cases, not even a guy that ever is going to be like a playoff rotation caliber guy. So to me, it's like, if you're acquiring a first round pick, my immediate question would be like, well, can you trade that pick straight away, make it a 3-way or something to get somebody that can play for you next year, year after, and you feel higher confidence is going to be a player. So I don't know. I'm always a little torn, and that kind of brings me to the last guy that I think is at least worth thinking about on draft night, which is Marjon Beauchamp. I don't think they're going to trade Marjon Beauchamp, but year one, year two with guys like him are kind of these interesting periods because if they show some stuff, which Marjon showed some stuff last year, I think they're going to have some value around the league to some teams because they're still going to have a little bit of that like upside glow. But a year from now, if Marjon Beauchamp has the same year next year that he had this year, he's not going to have a whole lot of value, around the league. So I think it's, we talked about it leading up to the trade deadline. You have to, again, ask the question of like, are you really helping yourself in the grand scheme of things with your title window open right now by kind of keeping the, glimmer of the upside and hoping that the guy will develop and be a player for you, and weigh that against what you could potentially get. And again, I don't know what Marjon Beauchamp's value, is. Could you get a late first round pick for him? Probably somewhere, right? I think that's reasonable. But it's again, these are the really difficult kind of trade-offs that John Horst and that front office are going to have to do. And so I don't think they're going to do anything with Marjon Beauchamp, but we're now at the 1 year anniversary of them acquiring him. And, if guys don't really start to show something year by year two, certainly by year three, they become depreciating assets. And then it's easy to look back and say like, oh man, would have been nice if we had used him, in a trade to try to get a guy that we knew and had higher confidence he could play. So, anyway, I'm sure we'll have lots of, assuming he's around, which I expect it will be, we'll have lots of kind of Vegas discussions about Marjon and, what he means, and we'll see if they add anybody. But I don't know. I don't think that they're going to add like a late first round pick. I think they will draft the second round player somewhere. And again, I think part of that also is contractually, there's an advantage to getting a second round pick because you can sign them and have them count for less against the cap than signing even an undrafted free agent. Undrafted free agents has the same cap hit on a minimum as Wes Matthews if you signed him again, right? A 10-year plus veteran. They all count the same, roughly $2 million against the cap because the league doesn't want to basically disincentivize teams from signing veterans. But if you draft a player in the second round, sign that guy to a minimum contract, he'll only count for a little over $1 million this year. So there's savings that you can have, kind of having those end of the bench guys. We saw kind of played that game with Yorgos Kalaitzakis a couple years ago. Didn't work out in the end. And then also, I think the other interesting thing is this year they've now the new CBA. We always talk about complaining about it. They have added second round exceptions that every team gets, no matter where they are relative to the first and second apron. And so basically now, previously to sign a player to a 3-year contract, you had to use part of a different exception, such as a mid-level exception. Obviously, teams above the second apron, they don't have a taxpayer mid-level. So what the league has done is said, like, okay, basically it's more than the minimum. I think this year it'd be about like 1.77, I think, for a 3-year contract starting salary, which is still less than, you know, a veteran minimum contract, and a 4-year is a bit higher. I think it's closer to 2 million, but basically it gives teams a bit more flexibility to sign those second round picks to more than 2-year contracts, with a team option at the end. So again, that's another reason why I think second round picks are a little bit more interesting and useful this year and moving forward than they were previously. Alas, the Bucks traded a bunch of them away for Jay Crowder. But that's another kind of thing in the background to think about, and gives a little more incentive to come away with at least a second rounder from Thursday.
But if you are talking about someone like Jay Crowder, I think those are the types of guys, as you sort of alluded to, with your rotation during the regular season. Can they help you? What does it look like in the postseason? I think that's going to be part of the decision making of what the Bucks think that they could trade for a late first round pick anyway, because as you pointed to, the chances of you getting a rotation player immediately as a rookie with pick 29 or pick 31 historically is pretty low. So I think some of those veteran players the Bucks have to make a decision about are going to be interesting. I want to ask you about them next after we talk about BetterHelp, the sponsor of today's show. And we all know this. It's easy to get caught up in what everyone else needs from you and never take a moment or some time to think about what you need from yourself. Therapy can help you in that regard, and it can give you the tools to find more balance in your life so you can keep supporting others without leaving yourself behind. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online and designed to be convenient. You don't have to run into anyone. You don't have to see any people. It's all in the comfort of your home. And you're with a licensed therapist. But if it's not working out for you, you can switch therapists and find someone that suits you perfectly for whatever it is you need in life. So find more balance with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedonNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. So I was thinking a lot, and I've said this a little bit on this show, and we should remind you again, Wednesday, June 28, come down to Broken Bat Brewery. We're going to have a live podcast. Everyone will be there. Eric, Camille, Justin, Frank, and we'll have some fun and drink some beers if you want, and heckle us if you want from the crowd. I mean, there's all types of things that are welcome on that night. It's going to be a lot of fun. But I mentioned over the last few weeks, sort of covering the finals, trying to look at Denver, Miami to a lesser extent, but certainly Denver in terms of like, what are the comparisons? Is there anything you can look at from a Bucks perspective? And the thing I just kept coming back to is the fact that they were just playing 7 guys, basically. And I was thinking about all the podcasts we had and counting, well, there's 12 guys. Which one of these 12 guys is going to play? Is Wesley Matthews going to play some minutes tonight? Are they just resting him for the postseason? Where does Jay Crowder fit into the mix? Is Joe Ingles a postseason player? And part of that is just, I think, the situation the Bucks are in, whereas if you want to add veterans on these low contracts, some of them might want to play. They might be in a situation where they still want to play, and that can dictate what team they want to go play for. So I'm curious, with this new coach, the Bucks are limited. Are they going to have to trade one of these guys for an asset, as we've looked at? Would it be just pure saving money? I'm not sure. But the guy I mentioned yesterday on the podcast with Howard Beck that you should go check out, I thought it was an interesting chat, is someone like Bruce Brown, who is there someone out there, or is it Jay Crowder? I mean, how do you view all these veterans that the Bucks had in terms of someone that actually, after a full season, because remember, Joe Ingles came back halfway through the season off an ACL. Obviously, he's older. We get that. But he did some things that you're like, okay, that can help this Bucks team, particularly offensively. Jay Crowder, we never saw the best of. But I think the idea of both of those guys, we at least thought about it through the season that they could help in the postseason.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the way I view it is, are you giving this guy a minimum contract, or are you giving this guy like one of these, is this guy the taxpayer mid-level guy that, like, if some, there are ways potentially, depending on Chris and Brooks' situation, you could potentially have a taxpayer mid-level $5 million number or some portion of it that you might be able to spend. if it was Chris Paul, right, for the sake of argument, I don't think, based on what we heard 3 years ago ahead of the Drew Holiday trade, it didn't seem like Giannis was a big Chris Paul fan. I don't know if anything would have changed between now and then. To the extent that Giannis is the shadow GM, I don't know, the Bucks are going to push hard for Chris Paul, and as Howard Beck mentioned yesterday, all the indications are that he wants to stay close to his family in LA anyway. But again, if you told me hypothetically Chris Paul will sign for the tax fair mid-level and you're going to have to move some things around or whatever it might be, I would say yeah, let's do it, right? I mean, I think again, as much as Chris Paul is not the player he was, there's going to be matchups where it's problematic. Sure, roll the dice, but I think Joe Ingles, as an example, Joe Ingles on a minimum, come on back, Joe. Like, absolutely, like let's make this happen. Joe's in a bit of an interesting spot. He's not a bird free agent technically because he was only in Milwaukee a year, but non-bird free agents, you can actually sign them for 120% of what you had them at last year, which obviously, nobody, they're not going to pay Joe 120% of $6.4 million. That's almost $8 million. I don't think that's his market anyway. But again, at this point, this first year, we're talking about really only a 1-year contract, obviously. I would happily take Joe back, especially if it didn't mean sacrificing on other players. But again, I think in practice, certainly any chance you have of using the tax for mid-level probably goes out the window if you give Joe more than a minimum contract. But at a minimum, I would happily take him back. Is this a year where some of the defensive issues become a bit too much? Potentially, right? But to your point, if he's not a playoff 8-man rotation guy because of that, well, you were only paying him a minimum, right? And I think he's a guy that can definitely help you get you through the regular season. And it's not like, the postseason rendered the idea of the Bucks needing, more playmaking, an invalid concept, right? I think that obviously became a pretty obvious glaring need again, especially in those fourth quarters. But obviously the question is okay, well, Joe Ingles probably isn't like your crunch time guy creating shots for you, right? Understandably. So I think for Joe, I would happily take him back on a minimum. I think Crowder's tough. I mean, I think we talked about it. I was skeptical that if he was ever going to be like a wing defender anyway, because he's really was really a full-time 4 in Phoenix. Does he have some switchability? I think he probably still does. The irony is he shot the ball actually well after he came back. And even I think his numbers were actually pretty good, especially offensively. But then, yeah, in the playoffs, just those 5 games, obviously, got DNP'd, which we've seen with Bud in the past, right? Like the Nikola Mirotic experience. And this is the hard part too with, when you can't stick around in the playoffs. Jay Crowder's been a guy who's had hot and cold shooting runs in particular, in previous years with Phoenix as well. When you get ousted right away, all these guys, these role players, they don't get a chance to find a better matchup. They don't get a chance to have their moment in the sun and have, that series where they really make a difference. Maybe the second round would have been the series when Jay Crowder made a difference. Again, who knows? I think with Jay, I think.
Well, Frank's having some issues there. The one thing I would say about Jay Crowder's shooting, though, I looked at the numbers and the numbers were pretty good. But I didn't really remember him knocking down many threes at all. I know that he didn't play a lot with this team, for sure. But it didn't feel like he had some of those hot nights. I think he had one regular season game where he knocked down a bunch of threes. But ultimately, I think the defensive stuff was what we wanted to see from Jay Crowder more than anything. And we just never really got to the defensive stuff. I'm just carrying on, Frank, about the Jay Crowder stuff. But to your point, and I'll come back to you. I'll get to a FanDuel first, but I'll come back to you. But I think with Jay Crowder, the thing that's interesting when you talk about defending smaller guys, this is where the crunch was, because if Wes Matthews was your best Jimmy Butler defender, which honestly might have been the case. I mean, probably Drew Holiday, but he didn't have a lot of luck, and Giannis was hurt. So out of the role players, if Wes Matthews was the best guy, and Jay Crowder was more suited to defending smaller guys, all we saw was Joe Ingles against smaller guys right through the regular season as well. So in the end, for a playoff rotation wise, they kind of outmatched each other there, but or canceled each other out. But I'll come back to you in just a sec, and we can continue that chat, because I do think that for fans, I'm curious what they feel about Jay Crowder. But our friends over at FanDuel sponsoring the show today, and baseball season's in full swing. I'm going to a Brewers game today, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sports book, because right now, new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back in bonus bets. If your first bet doesn't win, just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to join today. And I'm looking at the NL Central. The Brewers, the favorites, plus 115. The Cubs, they're second. And, the Reds, I think the Reds
That's
are
a
on fire.
sad statement about the NL Central that the Brewers are favored right now. It's like who can finish a game above 500 feels like the race in the NL Central right now.
Well, I had an argument. This was going back to 2020 when I was still living here, or when I was last living. Well, I'm not living here. When I was still living here, and the argument from this person who will not be named was that no. The only reason the teams are all around 500 is because they're so good and competitive. This is one of the most competitive. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure it just means they're all mediocre. But I went to the Brewers game on Saturday. I'm going again today. I'm so far 1-0. And I'm looking to keep that streak going. But make sure you go to FanDuel anyway, because there's a pretty sweet deal there. Don't miss your chance to snag that no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. Go get yourself some cash there and a no-sweat first bet with FanDuel. All right, Frank, you got cut off there at mid Jay Crowder thoughts, but where are we at?
Yeah, I think with Crowder's, to me, the biggest question, I think Crowder's future is probably closely correlated or inversely correlated in this case with Bobby Portis's. If Bobby Portis is your third big and he's basically soaking up, most of the backup center and power forward minutes behind Giannis and Brooke, then, I mean, we talked about this when they acquired him. Then, okay, so you're gonna have to play Jay Crowder small forward minutes. Okay, well, you got Chris Middleton, you got Pat Connaughton, Marjon Beauchamp's somewhere in this discussion potentially as well. So what's Jay Crowder's role? And I think that was, to me, like kind of always sort of the interesting part of the fact that they chased him for so long last year. I think having another guy, I mean, on the margins, like, yeah, give me Jay Crowder when I don't have to give up, another rotation player. Like, yeah, sure. Like, the water's warm, like come join the party. But going into this offseason where the dollars are short, and you in all likelihood they're going to do whatever they can probably to stay under that second apron. I think it does raise the obvious question of like, okay, so seriously though, like what's Jay Crowder's role going to be? And again, if there was a decision to trade Bobby Portis for for instance a ball handler, okay, well then you need somebody else that's going to play power forward, potentially somebody else that's going to play center. So then Jay Crowder would become, I think, much more interesting as a small ball four. Maybe that would have you leaning more into Giannis playing more at the 5 if he was effectively your third big. But as long as Bobby Portis is around and, Chris and Pat Connaughton are around, then I kind of look at Jay Crowder and I'm like, well, what's really the role here other than depth, especially when playoff time comes and rotations shrink and, you're playing 7-8 guys, right? You're really only relying on 7-8 guys. And again, like, as long as, even in a playoff scenario, even if you said like Bobby Portis is gone, is Jay Crowder like effectively your third big? I'd say we all should have some reservations around that. There's definitely some risk in doing that. There's some chance that, Jay Crowder's best days are well in the rear view at this stage. But again, I think the question then is like, well, what's your next best option? And, again, some of this comes down to philosophy. And does Adrian Griffin want to play a lot smaller? Does he want to, kind of continue to use size the way the Bucks have to varying extents over the past couple of years? But again, I'm very curious what the Crowder kind of decision is going to be. I'm sure he wants to make more than, $5 million, but I don't know if the Bucks can really afford to pay him a whole lot more than that unless they shed some of this other salary without taking a fair bit back. And Milton Newton on Instagram posted a picture of him and John Horst with Jay Crowder like in Atlanta, like kind of at like a workout where he's worked out last year during the season when he was away from the Suns. He was in Atlanta, I believe, most of that time as well. So I don't know, they were all smiles in that picture. Obviously those guys value Jay Crowder because they give him 5 picks to get him. And with Bud out, that probably increases the likelihood of Jay Crowder returning. And certainly with Monty Williams not in, that also increases the chance of Jay Crowder returning. But I don't know. Let me say this. I am not going to stake a lot of my kind of Bucks 2024 title opportunity, contention, whatever equity on, Jay Crowder and what happens with his future. I think that's definitely one of those things that I probably would not want to count on a whole lot. But again, he may have something left in the tank. I'm not closing the book entirely.
Yeah, and I think overall, when you talk about being the third big, Crowder's always been one of those guys that I think you think is taller than what he is. And then the question is, if he's turning into someone that's playing more the 4, or you're even thinking about playing Giannis at the 5 smaller lineups, then is that only because Jay Crowder's got a little bit older and can't defend the smaller guys anymore? Yeah. That's to me, that's interesting where the transition is, where his movement's at. And to be fair, he didn't play enough basketball for us to really know. But I'm just curious across the league whether there's teams out there that are like, okay, we saw enough. You were on $10 million last year. We'll give you around that. I'm not so sure. So it might just come down to his fit, where he wants to play. I'm going to guess that he didn't love the fact that he wasn't playing in the postseason. So Bud's not back. Does that help the entire new coaching staff? It certainly seemed like he liked all the guys in the locker room. So maybe he would be willing to come back. And I didn't see that Instagram post, but I'm curious how everyone feels about Jay Crowder and whether he's someone you want back on this team. And Joe Ingles, let us know all of those names. Frank, I got to get to a tailgate, so I could talk to you forever, but I'm going to bail. What else you got?
Well, one note. So we talked about a little bit in the whole context of Bradley Beal. And it's kind of funny. I was listening back, like we never really even talked when we potted out. We never really talked like what would the actual offer be. Obviously, he's been traded. I think with some type of 3-way, scenario, they certainly could have, I think, made a compelling offer value-wise relative to what Phoenix ended up giving up if you included, Drew Holiday. But Brian Windhorst often says like, if it's a 3-team trade, you have a no-team trade, because it's just like really hard to work out 3-team trades. And I think floating around, Bucks Twitter, like there were tons of different trade ideas that were thrown around. I mean, I think there were some interesting things that got thrown around, like for instance, scenarios where like Drew goes to the Warriors and Jonathan Kuminga, Jordan Poole go to Washington, for instance, like that. Like, it's like, okay, that's pretty interesting. But Bradley Beal ends in Milwaukee. Like, again, I don't know who's bringing the ball up the floor for the Bucks, but I think there's an interesting discussion that you could at least be had there, that like all 3 teams are better off for a trade like that. But at the end of the day, again, like I don't think Bradley Beal, or maybe Bradley Beal's wife, wanted to come to Milwaukee relative to Phoenix, relative to Miami, and some people were like saying, like I made the comment about maybe to some extent like John Horst's efforts here were somewhat performative, right? Given that our thesis was this was really kind of driven by Giannis. And some people were just like, a couple people were like, oh, you think he's lying to Giannis and like faking interest in this and it's like, oh, Giannis is going to see through that. It's just like, guys, okay, first off, like most of being a front office person is like, chasing stuff that's like never really going to happen, and, doing stuff in somewhat performative ways. And third off, if you're coming out with that, like, I feel like there's no way you're married, because like lots of good relationships involve doing things that are somewhat performative, right? Like, okay, yeah, we can do that. And, like, I'll look into this or whatever it is. Like, it doesn't mean that if the Bucks don't, put everything on the table for Bradley Beal, that does not mean that they're lying to Giannis, or, Giannis is going to see right through things and, demand a trade or something like that. Like, whatever. Like this stuff happens all the time. Owners, want GMs to do stuff, and it's like, yeah, okay, we'll try to do that thing that you think is a good idea. And, that's part of the art of being a GM, is kind of keeping people happy, and sometimes, not doing things in ways that, you maybe didn't want to do them. But you don't make the other folks that are vested parties feel like, you just ignored them. So yeah, again, feels like the Bucks gave it the old college try. Hey, Bradley, we'll talk to Bradley and his agent, Mark Bartelstein, who, by the way, represents 3 Bucks as well. So John Horst, lots of conversations with Mark Bartelstein. Anyway, including Bobby Portis, by the way. Bobby Portis, Javon Carter, and I'm forgetting who the third guy is now. But anyway, so yeah, I think the interesting thing too, and the other good thing, as we mentioned earlier, whatever was discussed, and Drew Holiday being a trade, being on the trade market, Chris Middleton, whatever, none of that ever, nobody ever seemed to take that seriously from a national media perspective, which I think obviously, as we were saying earlier, is a very good thing. We didn't have to get the whole, dragging your players through the trade rumors as much as Bucks Twitter may have done that. But we're always doing that. So yeah, I think it was kind of no harm, no foul. Didn't think it was ever likely to happen anyway. But it was definitely, a very unique situation, right? I mean, if Bradley Beal had said I want to go to Milwaukee, then I think it would have been a really interesting situation, because what would that have meant, right? They could have, in theory, signed and traded Jay Crowder for some inflated amount of money to make it work, and actually not needed to put in Chris Middleton or Drew Holiday. But then truly your tax bill would just be absolutely insane. So I'm gonna go ahead and say that probably was never likely to happen, and it would have had to happen in July and all this stuff that would have made it really hard to do. So given the timing of them wanting to do it now, it was always going to be super hard for the Bucks to do it, especially given that the Wizards, I don't think had much use for Drew Holiday given where they're going. And again, 3-way trades, typically no team trades, just really hard to do it. And I'll say too, I mean, you do see 3-team trades, but typically with these 3-team trades, 2 teams make a deal, and then the third, one of those teams decides, hey, we'll do this deal as a 2-way deal, but we would like to see if we can bring in another team and trade one of the pieces we're getting for something else. So you do see 3-team trades, but they're typically not, situations where everything falls apart completely if they can't get the third team, all the teams together at once. So anyway, just a note on that, and close the book on Bradley Beal for now, probably forever. Now obviously we'll probably be moving on to less interesting things, but I don't know. Kane, I don't know about you. I probably Portland is the most interesting team to me going into draft night, especially with the Bucks not having a whole lot to do. I'm already bracing for if the Trailblazers keep their pick and select a young guy and don't trade it for help for Damian Lillard. I'm already prepared for the podcast we're gonna have to do next week about Damian Lillard and why the Bucks are gonna have a next to impossible path to trading for him, because I feel like everybody is going to be obsessed with at least the concept if Damian Lillard suddenly becomes a trade target, which as of now he's not. As of now he's happy, but we'll see if he still feels the same way in 48 hours.
We will, and I think you're right. I think the Beal stuff is done, and we'll see whatever happens in Phoenix over the next little bit. But we will have a post-draft podcast tomorrow as well. The draft is on. Maybe it gets more interesting for the Bucks. So make sure you check out this channel. If you haven't subscribed or liked or drop a comment, all those things, it's free to do. A review, a little 5-star review. I don't think I've ever asked for that, but all those things are free to do and to help us. And look at this for timing, Frank. Let's get out of here. I'm going to baseball. You can be a dad.
Yeah, Emma Louise Madden is calling time on the podcast. So enjoy the game, Kane, and we'll talk post draft.